Welcome back, beautiful and amazing human beings. And just cutting right to the chase, obviously, everyone's eyes right now are nervously on Syria as we all anxiously await to see what happens. And to talk about that, we, of course, have Syrian girl, partisan girl, an expert in the field, especially when it comes to Syria, who has been breaking down all the important developments. And these developments that are happening right now are extremely important. Right now, as we're speaking, we are finding out that there have been military strikes on a Syrian airfield that has killed 12 Syrian soldiers and injured over 30 of them. And this, of course, is on the heels of the U.S. military and the Joint Chiefs of Staffs preparing for a possible Syrian attack. Now, who committed this attack? What's happening? We're still finding out the details. But Syrian girl, what have we found out so far? What is happening right now in Syria?
Well, the base that was attacked was T4A Air Base in Homs. That base is specifically for the defense of the city of Deir ez-Zor, which is also under the attack of ISIS conveniently at the same time. Usually, any air defenses that go to Deir ez-Zor to attack ISIS targets are coming from this T4 Air Base. So the way that it was attacked was through Tomahawk missiles, and there's videos of that on Twitter. Whether it's Tomahawks or a different type of missiles, I can't say, but they were definitely missiles that were launched. The suspicion at the very beginning was that it was the US. Now the US denied it, so the suspicion is falling on Israel. I don't think it really matters. At the end of the day, the US and Israel have an alliance. At the same time as these attacks have been happening, Trump and the French Prime Minister have been making statements about attacking Syria, or the French president, whatever their leader is called. And Trump and Netanyahu met 2 days ago, before there was even a chemical attack that happened, where Netanyahu basically said, no, you shouldn't pull out of Syria, or you're not allowed to pull out of Syria. So it's obvious that they needed a casus belli to create these attacks, and that casus belli was the chemical attack.
And I think people need to realize that the Syrian conflict is mainly a larger proxy war, especially between not just the Syrian government and rebel groups, but of course we have many different sides here, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, predominantly facing off against Iran, Russia, and the Syrian government. Now, what we're seeing here, of course, is retaliation for alleged chemical attacks that happen in Syria that, of course, the U.S. establishment and mainstream media are putting on Bashar al-Assad. But of course, many journalists are questioning the validity of those attacks, and there's a lot to question here, especially with all the information that has been coming forth. And I wanted to kind of get your opinion. What do you think has been happening with those Syrian chemical weapons attacks, and what is your understanding of them?
Well, first of all, we need to point out that the Syrian chemical weapons were already declared and given up in 2014. The area that was attacked is a city called Douma. It's being occupied and run by a rebel group called the Army of Islam. And of course, the entire greater Ghouta area had rebel groups which were linked to Al-Qaeda. Now, this Army of Islam, they had in the previous years, like 4 years prior to, and once again 2 years prior, kidnapped civilians from a nearby town of Adra. And these civilians were from the Alawite sect. They brought them into this Douma area and put them in cages and paraded them around the town and said that if the Syrian government attacks Douma or our rebel group, they're going to be killing the hostages. So basically they were using them as human shields. Now, these people are going to gas some of these hostages in order to create a false flag scenario. They've been doing it before multiple times. So many indicators that these attacks are false flags. The video that came out was of children and one adult basically in a crammed underground room. They looked like they've been suffocated to death. And just behind them is a stove burning wood. Now, if you're underground and you're burning wood in a stove, of course, carbon monoxide poisoning is the first thing that's going to happen. So they may not even have to have used the chemical weapons that they were making in the chemical weapons factory that was discovered by the Syrian military in Ghouta. They could have just made simple carbon monoxide poisoning. And that was enough for Trump to tweet, the tweets that he did, and for this missile attack to occur. And what's also interesting is this attack happened almost to the day of the attack that happened last year in Idlib. And before that attack, of course, Trump said that, and not just Trump, the US State Department said that their goal in Syria was no longer regime change. So around April 4th, then the chemical attack happened. Same scenario here. Trump said we're going to pull troops out of Syria. April 7th, a full-scale chemical attack happens in this Al-Qaeda group that has civilian hostages that they've been parading around, and also released a video 2 weeks ago that the hostages are still alive and still being used as human shields.
Yeah, the timeline is almost exactly the same. So from what we've seen it exactly last year, where even in March 30th, we have the Reuters headline, U.S. priority on Syria, no longer focused on getting Assad out. And that was Nikki Haley, Trump's UN ambassador. Then, of course, on April 4th, 2017, almost exactly to the date last year, we had this chemical gas attack. And then on April 7th, which is just yesterday, Trump launched the attack on Syria with 59 Tomahawk missiles. And of course, we all heard about how this was in response to Ivanka Trump telling Donald Trump to attack Syria, to retaliate against Syria. We heard a lot of kind of misnomers from the alternative media saying, no, this is nothing. But again, what we're seeing right now is almost history repeat itself exactly with very similar circumstances, especially with Trump just a few days ago saying that he was thinking about just totally leaving Syria. Supposedly there was this internal conflict between the Joint Chiefs of Staffs and Donald Trump. We don't know the validity of that, of course, because they're, of course, all coming from insider sources. But what we did see that was pretty interesting was the U.S. mainstream media pretty much saying and vilifying Donald Trump for even raising those possibilities, and those possibilities even being discussed. The mainstream media took a very hard stance, and they, of course, stood with the warhawks, the neoconservatives. What also is interesting here, we had Russia warning that there could be a staged chemical attack weeks ago. We had the U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, 2 months ago say that there was no evidence that Assad used poison gas on his own people. And again, this is very troubling because we're seeing Donald Trump respond and pretty much call Assad an animal and point the finger directly at Russia and Iran, and threatening those countries, threatening those big alliances through this big proxy war is going to lead through a lot of problems. Obviously, the Russians are responding very toughly with all the accusations being swung around even before there's an actual investigation. And if you remember, just on March 13th alone of this year, Russia said that they would threaten military action against the United States if they attacked Syria. Now, of course, everyone is anxiously awaiting for the United States to attack Syria. You've been following this for a very long time. How do you see this whole situation unfolding from here?
Well, another piece that's important about the timeline, before I get to that question, is that Damascus has this suburb called Ghouta. This suburb was being held by the rebels and the Al-Qaeda-linked groups, which are called Al-Nusra, for 7 years. And this last few months saw that the vast majority of these areas were being liberated. The civilians that were being held in those areas and weren't being allowed to leave by the rebels, hundreds of thousands of them evacuated the area. Most of the rebel groups surrendered and agreed to either put down their arms or be taken to another area on a bus to Idlib. The only group that refused to surrender was this group in Douma, the Army of Islam, because they felt that they had these hostages from the nearby towns that they could use as leverage. They were on the verge of surrendering when making an agreement before this chemical attack happened. So the Syrian government has no motivation to use this chemical weapon. It was completely going to win anyway. There was no doubt about it. And in order to welcome this U.S. intervention, it's completely ridiculous to suggest that the Syrian military would risk that to kill 4 children in an underground room. So what do I think this is going to lead to? Well, now this is going to give Trump the excuse for not leaving Syria, in spite of the fact that, like, most of ISIS has been relegated to pockets in the desert, and there's no reason for the US troops to be there. And in fact, two of them were killed recently. So now this chemical attack is going to provide the perfect excuse to stay in Syria for longer. Is it going to lead to a wider regional war? Possibly. It might. Anything can happen at this point because it's very easy to spark a world war. If Russia feels that it's being threatened, it might attack. Things can get out of hand quite quickly, and this attack has been a very dangerous one. So we're gonna see what happens in the next in the next few days, as France and America seem to be talking up the rhetoric, basically.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to talk to you about the French thing, but you're definitely right on that scenario because just even a few weeks ago, we saw the U.S. military directly engage with Russian mercenaries and engage in a conflict that left people dead. So already through this proxy war, Russian forces, mercenaries, and American forces are already fighting each other. And I think it's a very dangerous situation since there's so many countries, there's so many interests, there's so many other people plotting behind the scenes. It's impossible to exactly find out what really happened in that area, but many people are pointing to the fact that this chemical weapons attack, which allegedly is against Assad, makes no sense geopolitically. I mean, the Syrian government, along with Iran and Russia, are pretty much on the brink of victory, except for this one area, and also the areas that the United States controls in the northeast region, which of course is also an oil-rich region. Now we have the situation with Turkey unfolding with France, which is another fascinating situation since Donald Trump just spoke to French President Macron, and they were supposed to decide their kind of strong response that they're going to have towards the Syrian government. We see Turkey intervening now, which hasn't been a friend of Syria, which even had clashes with the Syrian government, saying and warning the French troops not to go to Syria. So how do you see that scenario kind of unfolding, especially now with the French involved and the U.S. now invoking the French?
Well, basically, the way you have to see it is that France, Turkey, and the US are a bunch of vultures that are trying to pick off the corpse of what they believe to be a dead Syria. They're trying to basically divide the areas of control. France had its eyes on Manbij, and Turkey has its eyes on Manbij, because they have this deal that they want to make with the US that only everything east of the Euphrates belongs to their Kurdish proxies, and everything west of the Euphrates in the north of Syria is supposed to belong to Turkey, and France is kind of trying to carve out its own chunk. Of course, at the end of the day, Syria is alive, the military is strong, and the Syrian president has said that the entirety of Syria is going to be liberated. So the idea that any of those forces are going to stay and take over pieces of Syria is a pipe dream, and it will lead to death and war and destruction. Already 2 US troops have been killed. This is sadly, only the beginning. And for what reason? For Syrian oil? The US has plenty of oil. It's not about wanting more oil. It's about making sure that Syria can't control and use its oil to rebuild, because that's going to threaten Israel. At the end of the day, this is really just about Israel and protecting Israeli interests.
Well, sadly, the propaganda has been ramped up, and we're seeing the drum beats for war being echoed not only by the administration but also a lot of influential media figures, and we can only hope and pray that no more deaths happen to any of the sides. The Syrian conflict has been a bloody conflict, and just when people were hearing that this could possibly go to an end just a few days ago, people were so excited about that news. I had so many people messaging me saying, yes, Donald Trump is doing this. I kind of knew deep down that there was something else up, and sadly we're seeing the ramifications of a bigger kind of scenario unfold that sadly, as you say, won't go away anytime soon. Partisan Girl, I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming here on this program and giving us your side of the story. Any last words about Syria and the latest developments that happened?
I think probably the most important thing to say is that we are closer to World War III than we've ever been in the entire history of the world. Both the US and Russia are in the same theater of war against each other, and it's getting hotter and hotter. So I'm hoping that the US people will do something about it. And Trump, whether you think he's playing 4D chess or not, the war is unfolding. So we have to raise our voices against it. And thank you so much for your viewers, and thank you for having me on.
And sadly, it's continuing and expanding, and hopefully one day will come to an end. But the first step to getting anywhere is to properly inform the people and getting both sides of the story, and that is definitely not happening in the U.S. mainstream media. Partisan Girl, thank you so much again very much. The links to your website and YouTube channel will be in the description below. If you guys found this message useful, share it with your friends and family members. Thank you once again for supporting Real Independent Media. I love you guys. Stay tuned for more.